Mark Holloway thought he was saving a life when he took in Lila, a quiet young woman with nowhere to go. 3 weeks later, his wife was missing, his daughter abducted, and his entire family torn apart. This haunting true crime story unravels how a single act of kindness opened the door to something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. Mark Holloway had always believed in second chances. He taught chemistry at the local high school and volunteered on weekends at the town's community center. A man of simple values, he lived with his wife, Claire, and their 2 children in a modest 2-story house nestled on the edge of a peaceful Oregon neighborhood. The Holloways weren't wealthy, but they had what mattered: love, trust, and stability. Their lives moved like clockwork. Each morning began with breakfast around the dining table, and each night ended with laughter over silly bedtime stories. It was a life many envied, and one Mark never took for granted. One cold Thursday evening, as Mark drove home from a late school meeting, the sky began to darken and rain poured down in steady sheets. The highway shimmered with water, and his windshield wipers struggled to keep up. As he turned onto a quieter road, his headlights caught sight of a figure sitting alone near a gas station bench. The girl couldn't have been more than 20, drenched, hugging her knees, her hair clinging to her face. Mark's first instinct was to keep driving, but something made him slow down. He remembered the stories Claire used to tell him about being helped by strangers when she was young and alone in a new city. So, against his better judgment, he pulled over. The girl's name, she said, was Lila. She'd escaped an abusive home and had nowhere to go. Her words trembled through cold lips, and her eyes were red from crying. Mark offered to drive her to a nearby shelter, but she begged not to be left there. She said she had been there before and feared going back. After a long pause, Mark called Claire. She was shocked by the request, but agreed they couldn't leave someone in the rain, so he brought Lila home. At first, Claire was distant. She didn't say much to Lila, but she kept a polite tone and showed her the guest room. Their 2 children, Emma and Josh, were curious. Emma, the older of the 2, asked if Lila was a cousin. Mark said she was just a friend in need. Layla thanked them over and over. She said she wouldn't stay long. Just a few days until she figured things out. The family nodded, trusting the story. In the days that followed, Lila appeared grateful. She woke early to help make breakfast, tidied the living room without being asked, and even offered to pick up groceries. She told Claire she once dreamed of becoming a nurse and admired how hard Claire worked at the hospital. Her compliments were always soft, almost rehearsed, but kind enough to disarm any suspicion. Mark appreciated the help, especially as Claire's night shifts had become more demanding. Within a week, Lila began to blend in. She joined family dinners, helped Emma with her homework, and even played video games with Josh. The children seemed to like her. She smiled often, laughed at their jokes, and listened closely whenever they spoke. Claire warmed up to her a bit, though a part of her stayed guarded. Something about Lila's expressions didn't always match her words. Her eyes lingered too long on family photos, especially ones where Claire stood beside Mark, but Claire brushed off the unease as overthinking. After all, this was a young woman in need. Mark felt proud of what they were doing. He told friends at work about the act of kindness, though he left out the details. He saw it as a lesson to his children helping others matters. Yet underneath that pride, something unspoken began to stir. The smallest details began to feel out of place. One afternoon, he noticed Lila's suitcase empty. When asked, she said her clothes had been ruined in the rain and she had to throw them away. It sounded reasonable enough. Still, small things started changing. A photo of Mark and Claire went missing from the mantel. Claire later found it tucked into Layla's bedside drawer. Layla claimed she had picked it up while dusting and forgot to return it. She apologized and seemed embarrassed. Mark believed her. Claire didn't. That night, she told Mark they should help Lila find a more permanent solution, perhaps connect her with a caseworker or a local shelter. Mark promised he would talk to her soon, but he never got the chance. The next morning, he woke to find the bedroom door slightly ajar. Down the hallway, Lila stood in the kitchen, making pancakes. The children were laughing. Claire stood silently by the window, watching. Mark approached and asked what was wrong, but she only said, "We need to talk." That conversation would never happen. Because 3 weeks from the day Mark brought Lila home, his family would be torn apart. And the kind act that began on a rainy road would become the center of a horror that no one could have predicted. The second week after Layla's arrival brought with it a slow but unsettling shift inside the Holloway home. What began as small oddities soon evolved into moments that Claire could no longer explain away. The harmony that had once defined their household now carried an eerie undercurrent, like a melody with a missing note. The changes were subtle, at first easily dismissed, but impossible to ignore. The family dog, Bruno, had always been friendly and calm, but now he acted differently. Whenever Lila entered the room, he tensed, ears back, tail low. One evening he growled so fiercely when she approached that Claire had to put him outside. The children were confused. Lila acted hurt. She knelt down, pretending to comfort the dog through the glass door, whispering to it. The next morning, Bruno was gone. Mark searched the neighborhood and called animal control. Claire made posters, but the dog had vanished without a trace. Layla suggested maybe he ran away because of the thunderstorm the night before. Claire didn't believe it. Dogs don't just disappear without a reason. Then came the broken hallway mirror. Mark found it shattered on the floor. No one confessed. Layla said she had walked by and found it that way. Claire was suspicious. The shards had been cleaned up too neatly, no footprints or scattered pieces. It was as if someone had broken it deliberately and taken care to hide the evidence before leaving it for others to see. Layla's nighttime behavior added to the discomfort. Claire would often wake up to the sound of footsteps, faint and slow, moving around the house. At first she thought it was one of the kids, but when she checked, both were asleep. One night she saw a light under the guest room door flicker, as if from candles. She stood outside listening. She heard whispering, but couldn't make out the words. When she asked Lila about it the next day, she claimed she was reading poetry before bed. Mark continued to dismiss the strange events, attributing them to stress or coincidence. He was exhausted from grading papers, managing the house, and now trying to support a troubled guest. Leela's presence had become so routine that he barely questioned it anymore. She helped with chores, cooked dinner, and even took the kids to the park when Claire had late shifts. Her helpfulness masked the growing cracks beneath the surface. Claire began to feel like an outsider in her own home. Layla had started wearing her clothes. Not just old sweatshirts, but favorite dresses and even a pair of earrings Mark had given her on their 10th anniversary. When Claire confronted her, Lila simply smiled and said she thought they were in the donation pile. Mark asked Claire to let it go. He didn't want conflict. Claire agreed, but inside she felt something tightening, a knot of fear forming in her chest. Emma, their daughter, became more withdrawn. She stopped drawing, stopped telling stories, and started sleeping with the lights on. When Claire asked why, Emma said she didn't like how Layla looked at her sometimes. Claire pressed further, and Emma said quietly, "She watches me when I'm sleeping." Claire froze. She asked Mark to speak with Layla, but he hesitated. He said maybe Emma was having bad dreams. Claire couldn't sleep that night. Something was wrong, and she knew it. The family, once so tightly knit, now felt like strangers sharing a space filled with tension. Mark was growing more distant, always tired, always trusting of Lila. The kids were uneasy, though they couldn't explain why. And Claire had begun to check the locks twice before bed. She no longer felt safe in her own home. One afternoon, when no one was home, Claire entered Lila's room. She hesitated before opening the closet. Inside, she found the guest suitcase completely empty still. On a shelf beneath some folded towels was a small, tattered diary. She opened it slowly, scanning the pages. The entries were dated and handwritten in sharp, careful strokes. The words chilled her. One page read, "No one questions kindness. That's the secret." They open the door and I walk in. Another read, "The woman watches me. She's getting in the way. She always does." Claire's hands trembled. She closed the book and put it back where she found it. She didn't say anything to Mark that night. She wasn't sure he'd believe her. She wasn't sure he even saw what was happening anymore. But she made a decision. The next morning she would call someone, anyone to help. That morning never came, because before the sun rose the next day, Claire Holloway vanished without a sound. The morning Claire disappeared began like any other. The alarm went off at 6:30 a.m., and the smell of brewing coffee filled the kitchen. But when Mark reached over to Claire's side of the bed, it was cold. Her slippers were untouched. Her phone sat on the nightstand and her car remained parked in the driveway. At first, Mark thought she had gone for an early walk. Maybe she needed fresh air. Maybe the stress had become too much. But as minutes turned into hours, panic slowly replaced hope. He called her phone again and again. No answer. He checked with neighbors. No one had seen her. The kids woke up confused, asking where their mother had gone. Leila sat quietly with them at breakfast, unusually calm. She told the children everything was going to be fine. Mark called the hospital where Claire worked. She hadn't shown up for her shift and hadn't called in. That's when he contacted the police. Officers arrived by mid-morning. They searched the house, questioned Mark, asked about any signs of struggle. There were none. No broken windows, no forced entry, no trace of Claire's belongings disturbed. It was as if she had simply vanished. When questioned, Layla said she'd last seen Claire the night before, around dinner. She claimed they had shared a conversation in the hallway and Claire had seemed distracted. The officers took notes, but no one had any answers. Claire's disappearance officially became a missing persons case. Mark was devastated. He began to unravel. He barely slept, barely ate. The kids grew anxious, clinging to him at night. Layla, on the other hand, began stepping in more. She made dinner, folded laundry, and walked the kids to school. Friends and family offered to help, but Mark insisted everything was under control. Layla stayed by his side, always offering a kind word, always ready to listen. But Claire's absence wasn't the only thing that began to shift. Emma, their daughter, became quieter than ever. She no longer smiled, no longer played. One afternoon, Mark picked her up from school only to be told she hadn't been there that day. Confused, he called home. Josh was still there, playing with Lila in the yard. But Emma was gone. Panic surged. Mark contacted the school. After some investigation, they revealed security footage showing Emma leaving the building early with a woman. The woman claimed to be her aunt. In the video, Mark's blood ran cold. The woman was Layla. Police were called immediately. Mark returned home to find the house locked. Leela and Josh were nowhere in sight. The backyard gate was open. Mark raced through the neighborhood, calling their names. Eventually, he found Josh sitting alone on the front porch, crying. He said Lila had gone for a walk, but never came back. She had told him to stay there and be brave. Law enforcement arrived within minutes. The home was searched from top to bottom. In Lila's room, they found more than they expected. Inside a small locked box beneath her bed were passports, forged documents, and photographs. Old photographs, pictures of other families. In each one, Lila could be seen in the background, always just out of focus, always present. Each family had a different name. Each one had been reported missing or had suffered some form of tragedy. And now she had taken Emma. The truth began to emerge. Lila wasn't the helpless young woman she claimed to be. She was a chameleon, someone who infiltrated families by pretending to be broken and vulnerable. She made herself indispensable, slowly replacing the roles of others until she no longer needed to pretend. In some cases, families disappeared. In others, tragedy struck in different forms. But in every case, Lila was at the center. Mark sat in shock as officers pieced together the timeline. Claire's disappearance, Emma's abduction, both orchestrated by someone they had welcomed into their home. Someone who had smiled at their dinner table and comforted their children. The betrayal was too deep to understand. An Amber Alert was issued for Emma, highways were monitored, bus stations checked. Layla had vanished completely, leaving behind no trail, no note, and no explanation. For days, Mark did nothing but search. He drove for hours, hoping to see a glimpse of his daughter, praying for a miracle. The investigation expanded to other states. Agents discovered similar patterns, cases in which women resembling Layla had been taken in by families only to disappear just before disaster struck. It was clear now she had done this before, and unless they found her soon, she would do it again. The only question that remained was how far she would go, and whether Emma still had time. In the days following Emma's abduction, Mark's world became a maze of desperation and confusion. He no longer went to work, no longer answered calls unless they were from the police. His home, once filled with laughter and warmth, now felt like a hollow shell. Josh remained silent most of the time, his eyes constantly searching for his sister's face around every corner. Mark tried to stay strong for him, but inside he was unraveling. Everything he knew about safety, trust, and kindness had been shattered. The police worked around the clock, but there were few leads. Surveillance footage showed Lila boarding a bus at a terminal 2 towns over, but the camera caught only her, no sign of Emma. A search of the station revealed nothing. No witnesses remembered seeing a child with her. It was as if Lila had planned every move with chilling precision. Then, nearly a week later, a tip came in. A woman matching Lila's description had been seen at a remote campground deep in the woods near the Washington border. Authorities swarmed the area but found nothing more than a burned-out campfire and a torn backpack. Inside the pack were children's clothes. One of Emma's favorite T-shirts lay folded at the bottom. It was stained and damp, but it gave Mark a sliver of hope. His daughter had been there. She was still alive. The FBI officially took over the investigation. Layla was no longer seen as a troubled runaway. She was now a suspect in multiple disappearances across several states. Her real name was unknown. Every identity she had ever used was fabricated, and every location she had stayed in ended in tragedy. A pattern began to emerge. She targeted kind, generous families. Families like Mark's. She became a part of their world, slowly dismantled their trust from within, and then vanished, often taking a child or leaving behind destruction. One profiler on the case suggested that Layla viewed family not as something to admire, but as something to consume. She wanted to become part of them, but only on her terms. And when that failed, she erased what she couldn't control. It wasn't about money or shelter, it was about identity. She didn't want help. She wanted belonging, even if she had to steal it. Mark couldn't rest. While investigators combed through leads, he took matters into his own hands. He posted flyers in gas stations, rest stops, and convenience stores. He joined forums for missing children and exchanged messages with strangers who had similar stories, people who had let someone into their homes, only to lose something precious. A quiet pattern of victims formed across state lines, each story eerily like his own. Then, in one of those message boards, Mark received a direct message from a woman in Idaho. She said she had seen a woman resembling Layla at a thrift store in a small town. The woman had a child with her, quiet, pale, holding a worn-out stuffed rabbit. The woman claimed she overheard the child call out the name Emma before being hushed. The tip was forwarded to the FBI, who rushed to the location. By the time they arrived, the store clerk confirmed that the woman had left only hours before heading north. This time they moved quickly. With the help of highway patrol, they tracked a stolen vehicle abandoned near an abandoned farmhouse deep in the woods. The property had long been empty, and the doors were left wide open. The inside was in disarray, old furniture overturned, food wrappers scattered. A mattress had been dragged into the living room, and on the wall, scrawled in what looked like charcoal, were crude drawings of family stick figures labeled with names. One of them was Mark, another was Claire, another was Emma. In a small cupboard under the stairs, officers found a journal. Inside were pages of erratic writing, filled with phrases like, "They never stay," "She watched too closely, and the girl belongs to me now." But there was no sign of Emma, no trace of Lila, only silence and the cold imprint of where they had been. That night, Mark sat in his car outside the property, gripping the last page of the journal. In the final entry, Lila had written a single sentence, "They always leave me, but she won't." Mark knew then this wasn't random, this was personal, and he was running out of time. The final stretch of the search began with a whisper and anonymous call placed to a tip line. The voice on the other end was trembling, uncertain, and refused to give a name. But the message was clear. A woman matching Layla's description had been spotted entering an old church-turned shelter in the outskirts of a logging town near the Canadian border. The caller claimed she wasn't alone. There was a little girl with her who looked frightened, kept close, and didn't speak. Authorities had nearly given up on credible sightings, but this one felt different. The woman had stayed for 2 nights and told staff she was escaping a dangerous man. It was Layla's signature, twisting the truth just enough to earn sympathy and blend in. By the time agents arrived, the shelter was empty. Layla had vanished again, but not without leaving a trail this time. One of the volunteers had managed to copy down the license plate of a car she was seen entering. It was stolen, but it gave direction. Roadblocks were set up. Patrol units combed highways, back roads, and old service routes. The car was finally found abandoned in the woods just a few miles from the border, near a stretch of river that cut through the dense forest. Search teams swept the area with dogs and drones. Hours passed. Just as the sun began to dip behind the trees, a flash of pink was spotted through the branches, a small jacket snagged on a low-hanging branch. Beneath it, footprints led down a narrow slope toward a hidden shack nearly swallowed by overgrowth. The structure was old and decaying, likely once used by hunters. A single padlock secured the front door. Officers moved in quietly, breaching the door and sweeping the room. Inside, crouched in the corner behind a barricade of furniture, was Emma, pale, shaken, but alive. She clutched a stuffed rabbit to her chest and didn't speak a word. It was as if her voice had vanished in the shadow of what she had endured. Medics carried her out gently while officers continued to search for Layla, but she was gone again. A trapdoor in the floor had been forced open, revealing an escape tunnel that led into the woods. By the time they followed the trail, it ended at the riverbank. No tracks, no signs, just running water and empty silence. Emma was reunited with Mark 2 days later at a hospital under high security. The moment he saw her, every ounce of strength he had left collapsed. He held her in his arms and wept quiet, uncontrollable sobs. Emma didn't speak. She only nodded when asked if she was okay. But she didn't let go of Mark for a long time. She wouldn't sleep unless he stayed in the room. She refused to speak Lila's name. Doctors said the trauma would take time to heal. As investigations continued, Lila remained a ghost. She had become something more than a criminal. She was a shadow that slipped through systems, identities, and lives. They never learned her real name. Her fingerprints matched no database. Her background was a patchwork of lies so carefully constructed that even the best analysts couldn't unravel them completely. She had built her life around vanishing, and she had done it again. The Holloway family never fully recovered. Claire's fate was never confirmed. Though Mark held on to hope, authorities privately suspected she had been killed within days of her disappearance. Searches uncovered nothing. Her body was never found. Josh, too young to fully grasp the magnitude of what had happened, grew up with only fragmented memories of the woman who once called herself Lila. Emma's recovery was long and painful. With therapy and support, she slowly began to speak again. She described days spent locked in rooms, whispered stories. Lila told her stories about how families were cages and how she was rescuing Emma from hers. She said Lila had spoken often about Claire, saying she had to go because she saw the truth too soon. But even in her retellings, Emma never saw Lila a monster. She described her as someone sad, desperate, and broken. A woman who wanted to belong so badly she destroyed every place she entered. Mark eventually moved away from the home they had built. It stood too full of memories, too haunted by what had happened inside its walls. The story became a cautionary tale in the community about trust, about the danger of appearances, and about how evil sometimes comes dressed as need. The case remained open for years. Leads came and went, but Lila was never found. Some believed she drowned in the river. Others thought she assumed a new identity and started over in another town, waiting for the next open door, the next kind soul to take her in. But Mark never stopped looking. He carried Claire's picture in his wallet, and every time he saw a woman alone by the roadside, he slowed down. Then he would grip the wheel tighter and drive on, remembering that not every cry for help is what it seems, and not every guest at your table is meant to stay.